I'd like to tell you a bit more about the ab-initio description of monopole resonances in light and medium mass nuclei. This is the outline of my talk. After a short introduction, motivating and describing the aim and the reasons of this work, I will briefly go through the two kinds of formalisms which I've been using in order to produce some preliminary results, quite new actually, and eventually I will go through some conclusions and perspective for the near future. So nuclear systems, as you know, display two very different but complementary natures, specifically very peculiar interplay between single particle and features and collective behaviors. It's shown and exemplified here in this sketch, which is an imaginary experiment of scattering, which I'm showing the cross-section in the picture. And the low energy excitations are discrete ones and are explained in terms of single particle Hall excitations, while for higher energies instead, a continuum spectrum referred as giant resonances regions appears as the clearest manifestation of the nuclear collective motions. And these is best described, or at least imagined, in terms of liquid drop pictures, where you can imagine that the nuclear surface is vibrating and oscillating as a whole. And usually, giant resonances and resonances in general are divided and described in terms of the quantum numbers, specifically the angular momentum quantum number and the isospin nature. For sure, the nucleus itself doesn't know anything about the composition in multipolarities, but this is a device we use to study and investigate the different multipolarities. And in this work, I am been focusing mostly on the L equals 0 component of the resonance, which is precisely the monopole part of the resonance. And in the isoscalar channel, you have protons and neutrons, which are in some way resonating coherently together, so moving the one with the others. Whereas had we taken the other channel, so the isovector channel, the protons and the neutrons would have moved the one against the other. And for spherical systems, which are actually the easier one to investigate, the quadrupole component of the resonance is clearly well decoupled from the monopole resonance, as you can see in the sketch. But the situation changes, whereas we want to tackle resonances in deformed nuclei. Indeed, for deformed nuclei, the quadrupole resonances are decomposed in terms of the projection of the angular momentum onto some specific axis, in this case the Z axis. And so the K equals 0 component, for example, of the quadrupole resonance will eventually couple to the monopole resonance. And I will detail a bit more later about this effect. Giant resonances in general have been very widely studied in the last decades, both from a theoretical and an experimental point of view. They can be imagined as collective excitations, as I was saying, especially the monopole one as a briefing mode, so the mean square radius of the nucleus oscillating as a whole, involving most, if not all, the nucleus at the same time. And they can usually be described in terms of coherent particle Hall excitations. As I was saying, they have been widely studied in the past. So why studying them? Again, actually, both from a theoretical and experimental point of view, there is a renewed interest in this topic, which is also related to the fact that this allows to investigate new kind of physics and how certain peculiarities can affect the resonances in general, as it could be, for example, the effects of deformations on the resonances, as well as the effect of superfluidity, which plays a very significant role in nuclear systems since they are highly correlated fermionic system. possible effects of shape coexistence, and also some more exotic modes. For example, in this picture, I'm showing some densities from bubble nuclei, which could eventually affect the nature itself of the monopole resonance. And last but not least, how all these specificities affect the nuclear incompressibility. This quantity is kind of a bridge between finite systems and infinite matter, and can be also very useful to investigate neutron stars and in general astrophysical phenomena. So you can see that much is still to be understood even nowadays, because a systematic study involving all these features at the same time has never been produced, not even within the energy density functional context, which is the ground floor one usually chooses to work for the giant monopole resonance. And this because a very generic and powerful numerical code is needed in order to take into account all these effects. And all in all, the ab-initio description itself is still very seminal concerning the giant monopole resonance. So that our objective in general would be to have a complete description and systematic one from an ab-initio standpoint. Now, let me go through the two formalisms I've used in the last few months. Just to recall, in ab-initio methods as well as in EDF, actually, our aim is trying to solve the many-body Schrödinger equation. The difference, which represents the peculiarity of ab-initio methods with respect to energy density functional theory, is that the Hamiltonian, in our case, is an effective field theory Hamiltonian trying to carry a deep and systematically improvable link with the underlying theory of quantum chromodynamics. So we try to be as fundamental as possible. And giant monopole resonance, on the other hand, has always been mostly been studied within energy density functional theory, because this is more computationally affordable, typically, and mostly within a framework which is called quasi-particle random phase approximation. And this method has been very scarcely used for few cases of interest in the ab-initio domain as well, but for easy spherical systems. So that, as I was saying, these are the very seminal work I was referring before. And this work, I'm been investigating this phenomena using QRPA for sure, so this superfluid version of random phase approximation, but also something which is quite new, also from the energy density functional point of view, which is the projected generator coordinate method, which is clearly a method which is already widely used for many aspects, but has been scarcely used to address this resonance problem. What are these two methods I'm mentioning? So in both cases, clearly we aim at solving the many-body Schrödinger equation. With P-GCM, we try to write down an ansatz for the eigensolutions of this equation as a superposition, a linear combination of different constrained mean field solution. Typically, since we expect the monopole resonance be mostly associated with fluctuations and variation of the nuclear mean field radius, the main quantity we will constrain is the mean square radius squared. And as an example, in this sketch, I am plotting the total mean field energy as a function of the square radius. And then we combine the solution along this path. Ideally, it would be continuous mixing, but in practice, we mix a discrete number of points, clearly. And we can constrain more than one variable at a time. So the R square coordinate is the most important one, but we can also constrain other variables here generically identified with this collective variable Q in order to couple to other modes and to investigate this coupling. And for example, for the formed nuclei, we will be constrained as well the beta 2 parameter, which is an index of the quadrupolar deformation in nuclei. And this method is particularly interesting because it allows to restore the symmetries which are explicitly broken in this kind of method. So to restore the original symmetries of the Hamiltonian problem, and all in all, the linear coefficients determining this solution are determined variationally. On the other hand, QRPA is a boson-like, can be written down in terms of boson-like excitation operators. So we will have some ground state psi 0, and all the excited state psi nu can be expressed in terms of excitation operator with respect to the ground state. And it can be shown that QRPA represents the harmonic limit of GCM of the other method in one specific minima of the potential energy. And there are mainly two different categories of ways to solve the QRPA equation. The first one is the standard traditional QRPA matrix diagonalization. And the second one is QFAM, which stands for quasi-particle finite amplitude methods. And in this case, the computational cost of the problem is reduced. And this is achieved shifting the eigenfrequencies of the problem in the complex plane. Clearly, each of these methods has its own pros and cons. Specifically, P-GCM can handle anharmonicities and shape coexistence because of the very nature of this formalism. And on the other hand, QRPA cannot handle this kind of anharmonicities, specifically being the harmonic limit of GCM.
I know those results already, so I don't have questions on your presentation.
Sorry, I cannot hear very well.
Microphone was open.
Okay.
I
thought it was a question. Okay. So I was saying, but on the other hand, in order the problem to be tractable, we must select only a few collective coordinates when trying to enrich our P-GCM ansatz, whereas in principle, all these collective coordinates are taken into account and explored simultaneously in the QRPA formalism. But P-GCM, as I mentioned before, can restore the symmetries which are broken, which is still not the case for QRPA. And last but not least, P-GCM is more computationally expensive with respect to QRPA, which has a low computational cost, maybe not in general, but in the QFAM formulation of the problem. And specifically, in both cases, anyway, I'm working with the two very first ab-initio realizations of both these methods, which has been developed quite recently at CA. And thanks to the very generical nature of the code I'm using, we can access actually all the nuclei, which are nowadays clearly attainable by ab-initio method, so restraining our domain to light and medium mass nuclei, but we can access doubly-closed-shell nuclei, singly open-shell nuclei, and also doubly open-shell nuclei. And I would like to point out that this is a very new feature in our domain. So in the results section, I will be mostly showing this monopole strength of the resonance, And what is this quantity? Well, I would briefly call for those who are not familiar with this. And so we have, in the monopole case, the strength is described by the transition element between the excited state and the ground state, where the operator which mediates the transition is the mean square radius. The transition amplitude itself is clearly represented by the height of the peaks in the plot we'll be showing, whereas the position on the x-axis describes the energy difference between the excited states, so the resonance, and the ground state. Both in QRPA and P-GCM, one usually gets solving the solutions discrete number of peaks, but clearly experimental results are provided with a finite resolution. So in general, I convolute the discrete peaks with some Lorentzian functions. And so in the future, I will only be showing continuous spectrum. Another key quantity in this study are the moments related to the strength itself. They are very simply defined as the moment of a distribution. This is very classic and standard mathematical definition, but putting the definition of the monopole strength within this definition of moments, one gets two very different possibilities to compute the moments. The first one is described by this first discrete representation of the moments, but then we also have another equivalent expression for computing which we only need to know the ground state of the problem. So you see that in some sense we are shifting the difficulty of this computation from the knowledge of the excited states to the knowledge of the only ground state, but computing the average of some more complex operator. This moment operator are defined as following, and just nothing quite quick. They are written down in terms of nested commutators, which are not trivial at all to compute, especially from a computational point of view. But moments in general encodes the main physical features of the strength, as it could be the centroid of the distribution and the variance of the distribution itself, just to cite a few of them. And in my work, I'm also comparing these two different ways of computing moments, because clearly from a theoretical point of view, they are strictly equivalent, but this is not the case then when evaluating them from, with computers. So that I have derived and implemented in a P-GCM code these operators to compute the ground state, but I will not discuss the results in the present work. On the other hand, now I would like to show you the strengths I obtained for these very preliminary results. And before showing the results, let me point out that both these methods have consistent numerical setting, which means that I've been using main features for the selected one-body spherical harmonic oscillator basis, for example, and also the main interaction. The interaction is a chiral 2+3 nucleon in medium interaction, which is a very state-of-the-art interaction. And I will be addressing mainly the monopole strength, and as far as the P-GCM ansatz is concerned, we will be exploring at the same time the mean square radius collective coordinate, but also this beta-2, which, as I told you before, is needed to investigate the quadrupolar coupling, so the coupling with higher multipolarity, specifically to the quadrupolar giant resonance. In order to benchmark the code, I've been performing calculation for an easy nucleus, the doubly closed shell oxygen 16. Here and in the following slides, I will be always showing this total energy surface. If you remember, before I was showing a one-dimensional plot where the energy was simply a function, for example, of the coordinate r. In this case, since we are exploring two coordinates at a time, clearly the energy is a function of two different coordinates, specifically the mean square radius and the quadrupolar deformation, and the energy itself is encoded in the color code. And all the points in this plot are obtained performing different constrained mean field calculations, the HFP level, Hasselhoff volume level, and the red dots indicate the point which are discretely included in the P-GCM ansatz, whereas the star indicate the minimum, and it is the solution for which one chooses to compute the QRPA excitations. In this simple oxygen 16 case, you see that we have a single spherical harmonic energy minimum, so it is best suited to benchmark our results. And specifically for the red strength here represents our solution, our calculations performed here in the minimum, so indicated by the star, and we are benchmarking these results against an already existing spherical QRPA code, which is in a more traditional formulation, let's say, which is here represented by this dashed blue line, and you can see that they are quite exactly superposed the one to the other, so that in general we can see the at least the QFAM code to be benchmarked against this existing code. Then we proceed to benchmark the P-GCM calculation. So saying the red strength we obtain here is provided by the combination of these red dots in the total energy surface, so mixing deformed solutions, whereas the yellow curve, the yellow dashed curve here, is obtained only mixing spherical solution, so without any actual deformation, but with different mean square radius. And in this case, you see that the red and the yellow curve, so the spherical case and the one which was supposed to include also coupling to the firm solution to the quadrupolar mode, pretty exactly themselves superposed, so that in general we don't have any coupling with quadrupolar vibration, which was mostly expected since oxygen 16 as a spherical ground state. And also you see that the blue line represented, so the previous QFAM calculation is not exactly the same, but P-GCM and QFAM are not expected to provide exactly the same results. And in general, we have a good agreement in terms both of the position of the peak and of its age, so that complexively can say that both methods can be considered approved, and we can go on some more interesting case. This more interesting case is magnesium 24. This is not doubly closed shell nuclei, it's actually doubly open shell one, so something more interesting is supposed to happen. You see that from first sight, the total energy surface itself is quite more complex than the previous one for oxygen 16. In fact, we have two different minima, the most important of which is the prolate one, which is supposed to be also the dominant one. And so that globally, the formation effects are expected to play a significant role and maybe also shape coexistence. But let us start comparing two P-GCM solutions obtained for static deformations. So the green strength represents the results of the calculation obtained mixing only spherical solutions, so along this green line on the surface, and the yellow strength represents clearly the mixing of the solutions along this yellow line, so with a static deformation, which is supposed to be the one which minimizes the mean field energy. And you can see that already from this at the static level there is a significant effect of quadrupole deformation. But then let us also compare the results given by the coupling to higher multipolarities. The red solution represents the strength obtained from the combination of all the red points in the plot, so both oblate and prolate configurations, whereas the blue curve is obtained only mixing the prolate configuration. I don't know if you can see, but in this prolate region, each point is both red and blue. And clearly we have different results as opposed to the previous statically deformed solution, but in general there is a good agreement between the red and the blue curve, so that there is not a significant coupling between the two different wells, between the prolate well and the oblate well. But what is interesting is actually that we recover what I was introducing in my very first slides. So this coupling to quadrupole fluctuations is provided by the quadrupole strength. Indeed, the strength is split into two different peaks. The right one is more or less falling on the peak determined by the static fluctuations, whereas the first one is actually provided by the k=0 component of the quadrupole strength. It's a nice result. However, comparing the P-GCM results with the QRPA one, we can see that they are not quite in a good agreement. And from a proof of principle point of view, we expect P-GCM to be superior to QRPA in this case, because as you can see, the energy surface is everything but harmonic. So we expect higher modes to play, higher components to play a significant role, so that these important anharmonicities effect make QRPA unreliable, so that for this specific case, we think that this solution is to be rejected in favor of the P-GCM1. Still, in order to be sure, at least, we want to compare these our results to some recent experimental data. These data for the giant monopole resonance have been obtained very recently, have been published in the last few months by the Itemba collaboration from South Africa, and they match quite better with P-GCM with respect to QRPA, so that our conclusions are maybe correct. And clearly, these experiments are fundamental for us to investigate the nature of these theoretical methods, but the data itself are not unambiguous. And I will tell you a bit more later about this experimental data. Now, the nucleus of interest I've been investigating is the silicon-28, which is itself another doubly open shell nucleus. As the previous case, we have two different two different minima in the total energy surface, an oblate one and a prolate one. In this case, it is the oblate minimum, which is expected to be the dominant one, so that deformation effect and maybe shape coexistence will play a major role. Comparing the results for P-GCM and QRPA, we can see that qualitatively, comparing the prolate configurations to the oblate one, we get qualitatively similar results. Indeed, the prolate strength is divided into two different peaks, both in QRPA and P-GCM, whereas the oblate excitation is mainly concentrated in one peak. But an interesting aspect is that in P-GCM, like in the previous case, I've tried to combine different regions of the total energy surface. The yellow curve here is only referred to the yellow dots in the prolate region, the red one only to the prolate, to the oblate region, and the blue one actually is obtained by combining all of these points at the same time, and you can see that the total result is very similar to the oblate one, so that in general no significant shape mixing effects appear, and maybe we are seeing a two-peak giant monopole resonance for the prolate shape isomer or silicon-28, but who can tell? And these are the complete comparison to experimental data I was referring before, and it's a very recent publication. The Hamiltonian collaboration provided results both for silicon-28 and for magnesium-24. In general, you can see that there is a better agreement with P-GCM results in all these cases. The other two plot results from previous experiments by a Texas group and the Japanese one. And however, we must say that these data are not always necessarily compatible between them. So clearly, a better resolution, better data in general would be beneficial for our investigation. But still, it is very interesting to see this pretty good agreement between the experimental data and the P-GCM solutions. The last result I would like to show you, the one I obtained for oxygen-20. Why is this interesting? Because we wanted to investigate superfluidity effects along an isotopic line. And you can see that the total energy surface is not particularly complex. So we have a single spherical minimum, as it was already the case for oxygen-20, oxygen-16, sorry, because being a singly magic nuclear, the sphericity condition is still preserved in some sense. But superfluidity effects may play a major role. And indeed, in the P-GCM case, we see the appearance of some strength in the low energy domain. Here, as usual, the red solution is provided by the combination of all these red dots, so trying to include coupling to quadruple fluctuations, whereas the yellow curve is obtained combining only the spherical solutions. And you can see that in both cases we have this low energy strength if it appears, and since also the two curves are not they are different, but they are qualitatively similar, we expect quadruple vibrations to play only a minor role. And the blue curve is the oxygen-16 as a comparison to show that in the previous case, this low energy strength was not appearing. In order to tell a bit more on this possible appearance of low energy strength, the next steps will be to compute a similar calculation, but combining constraining at the same time the mean square radius and the pairing parameter delta instead of the deformation beta 2 itself. Before going on, I must say that our results with P-GCM are quite inconsistent when compared to the QRPA solution. Still, this is also why I say that we must proceed with some more detailed calculation. Still, an hypothesis is that QRPA does not project onto the quantum numbers eventually, whereas this restoration of symmetries is actually achieved through P-GCM. So I arrived to the end of my talk. Let me recall what I've been showing you. I'm showing the first ab-initio systematic description of giant monopole resonance, and specifically one of the two methods I showed you. So P-GCM allows to choose the interesting physics according to selected coordinates, which enrich the ansatz. And in any case, both methods are very useful because in both cases we have no limitation of the nucleus of choice because of the very general nature of the implementation. And this is the plan of the complete study, at least in the next few steps I'm working on. By now, I have investigated the effect of static quadrupole deformation, as well as the coupling to quadrupole vibrations and the possible effects of shape isomers. In the next future, I will be trying to provide some theoretical for comparison of moment computation, as I was shown before, and to provide also on uncertainties linked to the Hamiltonian, computing different solution using different chiral EFT orders. Some more work is to be done concerning this investigation of superfluidity effects, and at the same time I'm also working on the comparison between two different nuclei, specifically silicon-34 and sulfur-36, which could tell something about the effects of bubble structure on the giant monopole resonance. And last but not least, I'm also computing some new nuclei, or some nuclei of current experimental interest, specifically nickel 68 and nickel 70. Nickel 68 has already been investigated from an experimental point of view, but the experimental data are currently being reanalyzed, and possibly in the near future some new data about nickel 70 will be collected. And I will be interested also in having your opinion about any other case you could think should be interesting to us. And that's pretty much everything for me. I thank you all for your kind attention. I thank you, my collaborators, and I would be glad to answer to your questions, if any.